Hi everyone. So far we have learned how to create an object, how to delete an object, how to update an object, and how to read the data from the database using repository. So why do we need a separate annotation while the property itself is being converted into a column? Sometimes the column name of the database and the entity property might be different. There might be several reasons, might be readability purpose or might be restrictions or best practices. So in this case, PAN number. As part of the entity, reading it as a PAN number it looks good, but in the database, we don't need to maintain it exactly as a PAN number. But in case of the first name and last name, the name is required. But in case of the PAN number, it is not required. So what we can do is we can change the column name. Here, column name is going to be PAN. So now the database table will have PAN as a column, but it will be mapped to the PAN number in the entity. So is this the one that the column holds it? Let's check. As part of the column annotation, we have name, unique, nullable, insertable, updatable, column definition, table, length, precision, and scale. We'll be looking at common ones, not all of them. For example, scale and precision, these will be used in case of the numbers or the decimals. And the length is the length of the column. So in case of the varchar, we can define length as 10. In case of the PAN number, by default it will be 255. The table property will be updated with the table name. Why would you need a table name? Sometimes the entity is not a table. Sometimes the entity can be a view, and view is composed with multiple tables and a very big join query, or might be several reasons why we are using a view at the entity, maybe for the just reading the data, or sometimes we need to update. At that time, the table property would help us to set the value at the right table and the column. And the column definition is nothing but defining a column in a raw database fashion. For example, the default is not supported in JPA. For example, if I need to set any default value at the column, it is not supported. Yes, we can set at the property. For example, here age I have not set, and it is a primitive data type, and it might take default value which is a 0. But here I can give some number. So this will be our default number. But this is achieved from the entity, not from the database. If I need to do anything on the database, then we can use column definition. And insertable and updatable, this would be covered later. And nullable. So here we are saying whether the column can be null or not. By default, it is true. And unique. So we are saying that the column is unique in the table or not. By default, it is a false. So how do we know it here? Unique by default false. Nullable true. Insertable true and updatable true. Generally, these will be used in case of the SQL inserts, and this will cover later. In the column definition, as I mentioned, we can create our DDL SQL format, pure raw SQL format as per the database. And the table, typically, as I mentioned, it will be used in case of the views are being mapped to entities. And the length by default 25, as I mentioned, and the precisions. These are for the numbers. So let's see each one. So in case of the PAN number, always I will be having maximum of 10 characters. So I'm saying 10. And can it be null? So we can say it whether null or not null, anything. So for example, if I go to first name, I can say this is nullable false. And exactly the same for the last name also. And for the email, I will say unique. So I need email to be unique. And the age by default, I said it is 18 here, so it will take 18. So we have covered nullable ones and unique, length, and name. These are the most commonly used properties for the column annotation. So let's save and run our application. Now let's look at the create table query, how it is been. Age not null, ID not null, and the PAN number, where we have changed the column name to PAN, so it has been impact, and the length as 10. And in case of the email, unique has been set. In case of the first name and last name, not null has been set. And obviously ID is a primary key. So this is how we are going to use the column annotation at the entity. So for example, I'm taking out the last name. That means by default it is null. So when I rerun the application, I should get an exception. Yes, we got an exception. Let's maximize it and fail to execute. Here it says, and here not null property references a null or transient value for last name. So this is how we are going to use the column annotation, and we can set the required properties for each column. So it would be similarly, if I set the PAN number is more than 10 characters, then we would get an exception. And if we use the email ID again for another object or another person, then we would get an exception saying that unique index has been failed, the way that we got it for not null property. So I'm taking it out this one, and the PAN number, I'm trying to add one more character. I added it and rerun the application, and we got it. Value too long for the column, and it is verifying 10 but got 11. So this is one exception. So let's correct it. And the email, for the email we have set uniqueness. So let's create another object and save the same. So I'm created person2 object over here, and I'm saving personal repository dot save person2. Rerun the application. Now if you see it, unique index or primary key violation, and it has been clearly says that index person_tb email, clearly mention it at which column we got an exception. And what about the first object? Let's see that. So the first object has been successfully saved, and this occurred only for the second object when we are trying to save the second person object by using the same email ID. So where unique constraint has been triggered and we got an exception.